The first dawn was already up over the salt pan of Anessa, and the second was coming, when the two prisoners began to walk toward each other across the white. Selleckmer stood at the midpoint of the red glass line with the gray staff in both hands and wished, not for the first time that morning, that he had stayed in the cargo business. The line had been poured a century ago by treaty engineers who had melted the salt itself into a ribbon of dark crimson, straight as a ruling, running 4 kilometers across the dead moon's largest flat. On one side of it stood the Hadral hegemony, 11 soldiers in storm gray plate, their breath vents fluttering at their collars in the thin, cold air. On the other side stood the Terran Accord, 9 humans in unarmored coats, hands visible, exactly as the protocol Selleck himself had notarized required. Between them, 2 figures walked. From the hegemony's side came the old Hadran Ossel Ren, 12 years a prisoner of the humans and returned now in a human winter coat too broad, his plated shoulders, his steps short, his 4-lobed eyes half shut against the salt glare. From the human side came Lieutenant Commander Merrick Voss, 8 months a prisoner of the hegemony, in the paper gray smock the directorate issued to the accused, walking neither fast nor slow, his escort 1 pace behind him. The escort was Captain Bansor of the Outer Banner, and he was the only Hadran on the pan that Selleck would have lent money to without collateral. It was Bansor who had insisted the human be allowed boots instead of detention slippers for the walk. It was Bansor who had filed, in writing, his professional doubt that a weather courier with a civilian transponder had been spying on anyone. He walked with his sidearm holstered and his vents calm, and when the 2 prisoners drew level with each other, 60 paces from the line, he gave the human's shoulder a small push of encouragement, the Hadran gesture for a road safely ended. That was when the side of his throat opened. Selleck saw it wrongly at first, the way one sees an impossible cargo manifest, the numbers refusing to mean what they say. A dark thread leapt from the captain's collar. His vents flared once, all 4 of them. Then Bansor sat down in the salt as if his body had been unstrung, and the sound of the shot arrived late and small, like a knuckle rapped on a distant door, and the pan came apart. The hegemony line dropped flat and bristled. The human line did not draw, because the human line had not brought weapons, which Selleck would remember afterward as the single fact the recordings could never be edited around. Voices roared over both command channels at once. Wren, the old cipher architect, stood frozen in his oversized coat, halfway to his own people after 12 years, and looked down at the dying officer with an expression Selleck could not read. And the human Marek Voss, prisoner of the hegemony, accused spy, 8 months in a directorate cell, 60 paces from the line and freedom, with every armed eye on the pan pointed somewhere else, turned around and went back. He knelt in the salt beside the man who had been guarding him and put both hands on the wound. Pressing the collar seam closed, he shouted one word twice toward his own line. The word was medic. The hegemony reached the body first, of course. They took the captain from him, and then they took him, not gently, and a directorate sergeant put Voss face down on the salt with a knee on his spine while the human delegation stood very still behind their side of a line. None of them would cross, because the protocol said they would not. Selleck stood at the midpoint with the gray staff and held it up and went on holding it up, the signal that the exchange was suspended, not ended, suspended, and no one anywhere on the pan was looking at the staff at all. A hegemony cutter screamed off the flat 11 minutes later with the prisoner and the body aboard. A second cutter took Wren, who was bundled back the way he had come, the exchange dead, his 12 years extended by a thread of dark blood on white salt. The human shuttle lifted without him, slow and level as if dignity were a flight characteristic. Selleckmer was left standing on a dead moon salt with a ceremonial staff, 2 abandoned camp tables, and the wreckage of the only prisoner exchanged the hegemony and the Accord had attempted in 9 years of cold border. He did what 40 years of claims arbitration had trained him to do at the sight of any disputed loss. He took the sample envelopes out of his case, and he got down stiffly on his old knees, and he began collecting the debris field. Nobody stopped him. Nobody so much as transmitted at him. He was a small, stooped Athedri civilian with paper-dry skin and a salvage arbiter's license, sweeping salt into envelopes and writing tag numbers on them with a scribe pen, and to both fleets watching from orbit, he was already what he had been at the start of the morning, which was furniture. He tagged the place where the captain fell. He tagged the boot prints, his envelope numbers marching outward in the spiral pattern the Kars anchorage insurance guilds had used since before the hegemony had a throne. 40 paces out along the probable line of fire, he found a casing fragment no longer than his smallest finger, the alloy still warm-smelling, its lot stamp half-sheared but half-legible, and he tagged that too, envelope 41, and noted the bearing. It did not occur to him that morning that he was holding the rest of his life in a paper envelope. It only occurred to him that someone's underwriter was going to have an extremely bad year. The hegemony announced the trial before the captain was ashes. The proclamation went out on every public band the Directorate of Continuance controlled, which was all of them. The human spy Marek Voss, it said, having been granted by the hegemon's mercy a road home, had instead procured the assassination of his own escort, the decorated Captain Bansor, in order to disgrace the throne before the galaxy. The exchange was revoked. The accused would face the chamber of the standing light in public inquiry, and the question put to the chamber would be the question of his life. Selak listened to the proclamation twice in his office on Kars Anchorage, with the lights off, which was an old habit when thinking, because the Ethedri had evolved in caves and his people still build extra for thinking done in the dark. The proclamation was confident, fluent, and wrong in one small way that only a person who had been standing at the midpoint could know. It said the assassin had fired from the human side of the line. Selak had tagged the bearing himself. Envelope 41 had been 40 paces out on a heading that put the firing point not behind the human line and not behind the hegemony line, but high in the dead customs gantry to the north, on Andessa's neutral ground, where by treaty no one at all was permitted to be. He filed the thought where he filed all dangerous inventory, and he went to bed, and the next morning the hegemony drafted him. The summons was beautiful. The Directorate did nothing that was not beautiful. It came on crystal, with the throne's watermark drifting in the depth of it, and it named Selak Mur of Kars Anchorage, arbiter of the neutral instance, holder of the gray staff at the Andessa incident, witness of record acceptable to all parties, and it appointed him assessor of record to the chamber of the standing light for the inquiry into the human Voss. The assessor's duty, the crystal explained, was ceremonial and ancient. He would certify the exhibits. He would verify that what was shown to the chamber was what had been collected from the world. He would be the inquiry's neutral eye, for the hegemon's justice feared no witness. His niece Im read the summons twice and set it down on the desk between them as if it were leaking. "They are renting your reputation," she said. 40 years of honest arbitration, and they will spend it in 6 weeks to dress a verdict they have already written. You know that. "I know that," Selak said. "Refuse it." "Refusing it," Selak said, "is a statement that the hegemon's justice cannot bear a witness. They have written the summons so that the refusal convicts them, and therefore the refusal will never be permitted to occur. If I decline, I will be discovered to have violated some licensing statute, my arbitrations will be voided, and a more agreeable assessor will be found." He folded his hands, 4 dry fingers over 4 dry fingers. "Also, child, there is this. If I am not in that chamber, then everything shown to it will be certified by someone who was not on the salt." Im looked at him for a long moment. She had managed his office for 9 years and could price the cargo of a hold freighter from its insurance schedule alone, and she had her mother's gift for hearing what he did not say. "You took samples," she said. "You always take samples." 41 envelopes, Selak said. "They are in the annex vault, logged under a hull claim that does not exist. We will not speak of them again in any room with a power feed." The humans reached him 3 days later, and they did it the way he would afterward learn that humans did everything that mattered, which was quietly, in person, and exactly on time. He had a standing reservation at a tea cellar on Kars's third ring, a Idri place, dim as a cave mouth, where the proprietor owed him a debt from an arbitration and paid it in privacy. The woman was already at his table when he arrived. She was perhaps 50 in human years, broad-shouldered, gray threading through dark hair tied back without ornament, in the brown coat of the Accord's Transit Claims Directorate, and she stood up when he entered, which Hadron officials never did for a Ithidri, and stayed standing until he sat. "Arbiter Mur, my name is Edekale. I direct transit claims for the Accord's outward authority." She set a card on the table, plain, no crest. "Officially, I am here about a refrigerated cargo dispute on the Velas run. The file is real. You will be paid for it. And unofficially? Unofficially, my government believes the exchange is not dead." She poured for him before herself properly, which meant someone had briefed her, or she had troubled to learn. The inquiry is theater. While the theater runs, both governments need a channel that does not exist. Channels that do not exist need a man both sides have lost money to and trusted anyway. There are not many. On the current border there is one. Selak drank his tea. It was good tea, and his hearts were beating out of rhythm, the way they had not done in years. "Madam Kale," he said, "I adjudicate cargo. Hulls, freight, salvage, demurrage. I have spent my whole life keeping out of the business of the great, because the great settle their claims with instruments I do not own. You are asking me to carry a secret negotiation between 2 fleets in the middle of a capital trial, under the eye of the Directorate of Continuance, which has just demonstrated on the body of its own decorated captain what it does to inconvenient outcomes." "Yes," Edekale said. "That is what I am asking." She did not soften it. He waited for the appeal, the flattery, the percentage, and none of it came. She sat with her hands around the cup and let his own sentence stand in the air between them, accurate, and the accuracy was the offer. Why me? He said at last. Truly, do not say trust. Trust is what people call it when they have not done the arithmetic. All right, arithmetic. She set the cup down. Both navies have audited you. In 40 years, you have ruled against the hegemony's hulls more than 400 times and against ours more than 300, and both sides paid, because your files held up. You have no family on hegemony soil except a niece you keep on Kars. You have refused bribes from people who do not survive being refused, and you have done it so politely they thanked you on the way out. And on the worst morning this border has had in 9 years, with one man bleeding out on the salt and 2 fleets going to alert above your head, you got down on your knees and worked the debris field, because the claim is the claim. Something moved behind her eyes that was not flattery. My government does arithmetic too, Arbiter. It came out to your name. The cellar was very quiet. Somewhere back in the dark, the proprietor's shell chimes turned over once and settled. The man on the salt, Selleck said. Your officer, Voss. The directorate will try him beautifully, and then they will kill him. You know this. A back channel cannot outrun a verdict that is already written. It can, Etta said, if when the verdict arrives, the throne wants to trade more than it wants to win. Our work is to change what the throne wants. The inquiry is theirs. The clock is theirs. But they have one thing left that they want very badly, and we are holding it, and they know we treat what we hold better than they treat what they hold. She looked at him. You walk next to your prisoner for 8 months of hearings, Arbiter. You will see it yourself soon enough. So I will only say this once, and you can weigh it however your scales work. We will trade people for people, full stop. We will not trade principles for people. If the price of Commander Voss becomes a betrayal of someone else, my government will grieve him and pay the grief. He knows that. He would sign it. Selleck sat in the dim and listened to his 2 hearts argue. He had built a long, safe, honorable life out of one rule, which was that the arbiter belongs to the claim and not to the parties. Both sides pay the fee. Both sides get the file. The arbiter walks the debris field, tags what is there, and writes what the tags say. And because of this, and only because of this, the freight moves and the border stays cold. A neutral man who chooses a side once is not a neutral man who chose a side once. He is a former neutral man. But the claim, said the older voice in him, the voice that had knelt in the salt, walk the claim. A decorated captain is dead, shot from ground where no one is allowed to stand. And the proclamation lies about the bearing, and the lie has a purpose, and the purpose has an author. And 41 envelopes are sitting in your annex vault saying so. The claim is the claim. You do not get to tag only the debris that is safe. I will tell you what I will do, Selleck said. I will carry messages, verbatim and sealed, and I will tell each side the truth about what the other side said, including the parts that bargained badly. I will not advocate. I will not invent. I will not tell either of you what to want. If either government asks me to pass a lie, the channel closes that hour, both directions, no appeal. He paused. And I am keeping the refrigeration dispute. The file is real and your shipper is going to lose. For the first time, Etta Kale smiled, and it changed her face the way the second dawn changed the salt. He deserves to, she said. He stacked the manifests himself. Thank you, Arbiter. Do not thank me yet, Selleck said. I have read the Directorate's proclamation 4 times. Whoever wrote it was not concealing a murder, Madam Kale. They were spending one. Somewhere in the hegemony there is a faction that wanted that exchange dead at any price, and we are now both standing on the price. He gathered his coat around his narrow shoulders. The freight term for what we are about to do is hauling uninsured through a war zone. The premium for that is everything you own. She stood when he stood. She did that every time, all the way to the end. Then, we'd better not lose the cargo, Etta Kale said. The chamber of the standing light was the most beautiful room Selleck had ever been afraid in. It stood at the heart of the hegemony's high capital, a vast oval of pale stone under a glass dome through which the local sun fell in one great shaft, so that the floor of the chamber burned white while the tears climbed away into cool blue shadow. 200 seats of the estates rose in rings, plated gray faces above storm-colored robes, vents fluttering, and below them on the burning floor stood 3 tables, the examiners, the assessors, and alone in the middle of the light, a plain rail of dark metal where the accused would stand. Selleck took his place at the assessor's table on the first morning of the inquiry with his guild seal, his scribe pens, and the absolute certainty that every object on his table had been catalogued by the Directorate down to the lint. First Examiner Davachon opened the proceedings. He was tall even for a hadron, his plate the deep slate of the Directorate's civil arm, and his voice was a magnificent instrument, warm, regretful, immense, the voice of a state that kills with sorrow. He spoke of Captain Bansor, beloved of his crews. He spoke of mercy extended and mercy defiled. He used the phrase the hegemon's patience as other men use a hammer, rhythmically to drive things in. And then he said, "Bring in the human," and the doors at the far end of the light opened, and Selleck got his first look at the cargo. Marek Voss was not large. The newsbands had made him large, broad as a bulkhead, cold-eyed, a killer in a courier's jacket. But the man who walked out of the doors between two directorate wardens was of medium height and prison-thin, with brown hair cut short by someone who had not been paid to care, and a face that 8 months of cells had pared down to its load-bearing walls. He wore the paper-gray smock. They had taken the boots again. He was in detention slippers on the cold stone, and Selleck, who noticed freight, noticed that he walked as if the slippers were boots, neither fast nor slow, all the way to the rail in the center of the burning light, 200 plated faces looking down at him with the fixed hunger of an audience that has been promised an ending. The examiner asked him to state his name for the chamber, Marek Voss, Lieutenant Commander, Terran Accord Survey Service. The examiner asked whether he understood the charge, that he had procured the murder of his own escort to shame the throne. There was a pause, not long, the length of a man setting down a weight to get a better grip. "I understand the charge," Voss said. "Captain Bansor walked me kindly for 8 months. Whoever wrote the charge never met him. It was 11 words past what was safe, and it was the most words anyone in that chamber would hear him spend at once for 5 weeks. The tears rustled, vents hissing, 200 translators murmuring into 200 earfolds. Examiner Owen let the rustle die, and smiled with the lower half of his face, and began beautifully the work of building the scaffold. Selleck sat at the assessor's table, certified the morning's first exhibit, and understood with a cold, clear, settling finality that he was not going to be able to stay furniture. The inquiry's first week was an education in how a state builds a fact. Examiner Olm did not rush. He laid the floor first, charts of the border, the demarcation statutes, the treaty that had killed Endesa and left it neutral. He called a parade of officers to establish that the human courier ship had been 17,000 kilometers inside the hegemony's claim line when it was seized, and he was careful always to call the seizure a rescue. He played the chamber the distress log of Voss's ship, the Magpie's Coat, a small vessel with a crew of one, whose engines had failed in a particle squall, and he played it twice, and the second time he stopped it in 9 places to show the chamber where, in the directorate's analysis, the distress was performed. Then he reached the flight recorder, and Selleck earned his fee. The assessor's duty was ceremonial, the crystal had said, and for 6 days it was. An exhibit would be brought to his table in its sealed sleeve. He would compare the seal number against the collection manifest, hold the verification wand over it, watch the wand go blue, and speak the old formula. The chamber sees what was gathered, and the exhibit would go up onto the great projection above the floor. 40 meters of glowing evidence, and 200 plated faces would tilt back to drink it. On the 7th day, they brought him the recorder transcript, and the seal was perfect, and the manifest was perfect, and the wand went blue, and Selleck read the first page while the chamber waited, because the assessor may read, that too was ancient, and he found that the transcript was perfect as well. Too perfect. He had heard the raw distress log 6 days earlier, with its squall static and its half sentences. This transcript had no static in it at all. Every sentence of the human's Mayday traffic was whole, grammatical and complete, the way no pilot in engine failure has ever spoken in the history of flight, and at hour mark 14 there was a course annotation, a deliberate dogleg toward the listening post at Vec Tower that did not exist in the squall-torn original, because between the static bursts of the original there had not been room for it. He could not say so. He was one small ithydri at a stone table under 200 hadron eyes, holding a seal that matched a manifest that matched a lie. The assessor certifies that the exhibit is what was collected. It was what was collected. Someone had simply collected it after improving it. So Selleck Mur did the only thing the ceremony allowed him to do, and he did it with a clerk's blandness that he would spend, in time, like a blade. He spoke the formula with one word added. The chamber sees what was tendered. A change of one word in a formula a century old, in the mouth of a foreign arbiter. Perhaps 30 beings in the chamber knew the formula well enough to notice, but the inquiry was recorded, all of it, every syllable archived in the Hall of Proceedings where the estate's own jurists could read it for the rest of history, and tendered was now in the record where gathered should have been, a tag on a debris field, waiting for whoever someday walked it. At the rail, the human prisoner turned his head only slightly and looked at the small alien at the assessor's table for the first time. Selleck did not look back, but he took up his scribe pen and on the certification slip, in the cramped ithydri ledger hand that the directorate's cameras could read perfectly well if they troubled to, he wrote the lot number of the exhibit sleeve and under it, unbidden, the bearing he had tagged on the salt. Envelope 41, North Gantry. He folded the slip into the day's file, and his hearts beat evenly, and he thought, there, now I have chosen, and no one knows it yet but me. The back channel met for the second time in a tramcar. It was Im who had worked out the method, because Im handled logistics the way other people breathed. The Kars Anchorage orbital tram ran a 51-minute loop through the freight rings, and at the hour after third shift, the rear car was empty, and the car's age meant its monitors had been writing static over their own archives for a decade. The directorate could know the two of them had ridden the same tram. It could never know more. Etta Kale sat with a flask of human coffee and a folder of genuine refrigeration documents in case. Selleck sat across from her with the gray staff across his knees, because the staff was now his cover, the assessor of record commuting to his lodgings, a civil servant of the proceeding everyone was watching. Your principal first, Selleck said, verbatim, as agreed. The Accord's position. Etta did not open notes. She had it whole. 1. The exchange concluded on Endesa stands as negotiated, Ren for Voss even, simultaneous at the line. 2. In consequence of the incident venue protections to be renegotiated, we propose joint overwatch and a neutral marshal of the walk. 3. The Accord will entertain reasonable additions to the protocol, but will reject any addition touching cipher material, key escrow, or architect Ren's professional knowledge. We trade people, not keys. That sentence is from my government's instruction directly, and I am told to repeat it whenever the subject rises. 4. The Accord notes that architect Ren is 78 years old and asks the hegemony to weigh time accordingly. And unofficially, she looked out the window at the freight ring turning past, gantry lights sliding over her face. Unofficially, arbiter, my instruction has a fifth point I am permitted to deliver only as spoken sentiment. The Accord knows Captain Bansor did not die at human hands, because no human on that pan was armed, and our orbital track shows a thermal bloom in the north gantry at the moment of the shot. We will not say so publicly, because we cannot prove authorship, and an accusation without authorship hands the directorate a grievance and buries the truth a second time. But you stood at the midpoint. We thought you were owed one true sentence to carry in your pocket. Selleck was quiet for a quarter of the loop. He had spent 6 days watching a state assemble its fact, and the work had been so calm, so procedural, so beautifully sealed and manifested, that a man could begin to doubt the salt under his own knees. One true sentence, freely given, unprovable, against interest, with nothing asked. He filed it where he was now filing everything, in the dark with the envelopes. The hegemony's reply to your points 1 through 4, he said, delivered to me this morning by the Office of the Lord Protocol, verbatim. 1. There is no exchange. There is a criminal proceeding. 2. Falls with 1. 3. The hegemony does not bargain for its own citizen as if he were foreign cargo. The return of architect Ren is a moral obligation of the Accord requiring no consideration. 4. The inquiry will conclude as justice requires. He raised one dry finger. And then, Madam Kale, as I rose to leave, the Lord Protocol's third secretary walked me to the lift and remarked, as spoken sentiment, that corridors in the Admiralty wing are longer than corridors in the Directorate wing, and that old men walk them slowly, and that a walk taken slowly enough sometimes arrives after the shouting has stopped. Etta's cup paused halfway. The Admiralty is telling us to keep the channel open and wait out the Directorate. The Admiralty is telling us it exists, Selleck said. In the hegemony, that is nearly a love letter. The outer banner lost a decorated captain on that salt, and the Directorate spent the body before it cooled. Fleets remember what is spent and who spent it. Somewhere above us, Madam Kale, there is an admiral doing arithmetic of her own, and our work, as you put it, is to be standing in plain sight holding the file when the arithmetic completes. The tram sighed through a junction. Etta refilled his cup unasked. The proof of life terms, she said. We accept your drafting. Ren may be visited at the border station by a hegemony physician and one officer of the outer banner. No Directorate presence, medical findings shared whole. We'd said it early. Arbiter, on the subject of time, there's a thing you should carry back, and it isn't a bargaining position, so tell them plainly. She turned the cup in her hands. Ren's hearts are failing. Our physicians give him a year, 2 with intervention he has so far declined. He says, and I am quoting the old man exactly, that he has no intention of dying in comfortable enemy arms out of spite, but that he would consider it a professional discourtesy to be late for his own funeral. He wants to go home, Arbiter. We want to send him. We have wanted to send him for 2 years, and the Directorate has let him rot on our side of the line because a living Ren at home is a complication, and a dead Ren in human custody is a banner. And there it is, Selleck said softly, the claim under the claim. He rode the rest of the loop in silence, doing his own arithmetic, and the sums kept returning the same remainder. The Directorate of Continuance did not want its architect back, and did not want its captain avenged, and did not want its prisoner exchanged. It wanted a wound. A wound on the border was budget, was mandate, was the estate's voting emergency powers by acclaim while the standing light burned white on a human spy. Bansor had died because the exchange was healing the wound, and the inquiry existed to keep it open, and somewhere at the top of that beautiful slate machine was an author, and Selak was carrying the author's penmanship home in a paper envelope. In the fourth week, the inquiry turned cruel, and the prisoner taught the chamber a lesson nobody had scheduled. Examiner Oln had built his floor and his walls, and now he furnished the house. He put the dead captain's service record into the light. He put the widow into the light, dignified, wrecked, asked by the state to perform her grief at the creature accused, and the tears' vents went thin and hissing, and the temperature of 200 robed bodies dropped towards something old and pack-shaped. Then Oln offered the human the door out. It was done with great theater. The hegemon's mercy, he said, was not exhausted even now. Let the accused acknowledge that the assassination had been arranged by the Accord's intelligence services without his knowledge. Let him say merely the truth as the directorate had established it, and the question before the chamber could become exile rather than the long dark. A confession that blamed his own flag in exchange for his life. The scaffold had been built tall precisely so this ladder would look kind. The chamber leaned in. The recorders leaned in. At the assessor's table, Selleck found his own vents had stopped. Voss stood at the rail in the burning light with his hands resting on the dark metal, and Selleck watched him take the weight of it the way he took everything, as if it were freight to be balanced before lifting. 8 months in a cell. 60 seconds from a signature to sunlight. 200 faces above him, waiting to be cheated of an ending, and one paper sentence between him and breath. No, Voss said. On, magnificent, regretful. Did the accused understand what he was declining? I understand it. Voss's voice stayed level. The same voice that had stated his name and rank, and what it did to the vast room was what a plumb line does to a crooked wall. You're not asking me to confess. You're asking me to help you lie about the man I couldn't keep alive. He filed a report saying I was no spy. He gave me his own bootlesses for the walk because the issue boots had none. Whoever killed him and knew the ground, and knew your protocols. He paused and looked, very briefly at a point above the examiner's head. I mark hulls and weather, examiner. That morning I marked weather. Your storm came out of the north. It went into the record before anyone could stop it, because the inquiry was theater and theater needs its microphones live. Your storm came out of the north. 11 words again, Selleck thought. The man budgeted words like a freighter rationing air, and he had just spent 11 of them telling the entire hegemony, in metaphor too plain for any censor to cut and too deniable for any examiner, answer where the shot had come from. The tears did not erupt. Hadron chambers never erupted. But the rustle that went through 200 robes had a different grain to it than the pack hiss of the widow's hour, and in the high blue shadow of the uppermost ring, where the military estate sat, Selleck saw an officer in the storm gray of the outer banner rise, very deliberately, and walk out, which in the hegemony was not an exit, it was a signature. That night, for the first time, the Admiralty contacted the channel directly. The message reached Selleck by a route so old-fashioned it was invisible, a paper claims notice, hand-delivered, regarding a salvage dispute on a hull called the Sarban, which was either a clerical error or a sentence. The dispute did not exist. The adjuster's callback code resolved to a private commerce node in the Admiralty wing. Selleck sat in his dim lodgings, holding the paper with both hands, hearts knocking, and Im read it over his shoulder and said what they were both thinking. The slow walkers have finished their corridor. The meeting that followed did not officially occur, and it occurred in the one place on the Capitol where the Directorate's instruments were forbidden by a jealousy older than the Directorate, the Admiralty's own dead room, a sphere of bronze and silence at the heart of the fleet offices. Selleck was brought there in a victualler's van, between crates of mess hall greens, with the gray staff left at home for the first time in a month, and when the sphere sealed behind him, he stood in front of the person who had been doing arithmetic above his head. Admiral Eket Suveth of the outer banner was old plate and lean as a mast, her vents scarred by decompression, one eye lobe dead and dark. The hero of the Telk Reach blockade, Bansor's first patron, the service record had said. And Selleck knew from one line in Edda's files that he had not yet found the bottom of something else as well, long ago, before the border froze. A student. Cipher School, class of the 9th banner, under instructor architect Ossel Wren. Arbiter, the Admiral said, you keep honest files. We are going to need them. She gestured, and the sphere's heart lit, and Selleck found himself looking at a fleet intelligence reconstruction of the Endesipan, the North Gantry wireframed, a firing solution threaded through its dead ribs in cold blue light. Sit down, said Suveth. Let us discuss salvage. What followed was the strangest negotiation of Selleck's life, because both parties spent it pretending it was not one. The admiral walked him through the reconstruction as if briefing a contractor. The thermal bloom in the North Gantry, captured by 3 independent orbital instruments, 2 of them human, 1 of them, and here her dead eye lobe seemed somehow to glitter. Belonging to the hegemony's own weather service, whose archives the Directorate had not thought to sanitize because the Weather Service answered to the Ministry of Tides, and the Ministry of Tides had not been told why it should lie. The firing solution, 1,100 meters downhill, cold morning 1 shot. The gantry's access records, which showed no access, which was itself the loudest entry in the file, because Andessa's customs ruin was sealed under treaty bolts, and the only organizations holding treaty keys were the 2 governments and the neutral registrar. 3 key holders, Suveth said. The Accord, who brought no weapons and gains nothing. The registrar, a Ethidri commercial trust that has not opened its copy in 60 years and would sooner die of shame. And us. She let the word sit. The banner did not open that gantry, Arbiter. I had a captain on that salt. So the question I am left holding is not who. It is how I prove who, in a state where the proving instruments belong to the man I am proving it against. And you believe I am holding part of your proof. I believe, the Admiral said, that a claims arbiter who spiraled a debris field for 2 hours while 2 fleets screamed over his head did not come away with souvenirs. Selak sat very still. Here it was, the moment his whole cautious life had been walking toward, in a bronze sphere with no recorder, before an officer with motive and means, and a dead student on her conscience, and the choice was the one Im had named in his office. Hand the envelopes to a faction, and the evidence became a weapon in a palace war to be used, traded, or buried as the war required. Keep them, and a state would close like a fist around a man who marked weather. Admiral, he said at last, I will tell you what I hold, and then I will tell you the price, and the price is not negotiable, which I am told is a phrase your government enjoys. Her vents flickered. Amusement, or the readiness to be insulted. I hold physical material from the pan, collected under Arbiter's seal, with bearings, chain of custody unbroken, logged to the standards your own prize courts accept. I will not describe it further tonight. Material of that kind has one lawful destiny, which is to be entered in open proceeding before the estates, in the standing light, where it cannot be reinterpreted afterward into something convenient. That is the price, Admiral. The evidence goes to the chamber, or it goes nowhere. It will not go to a wing or a faction or a fleet. Not even the fleet that is right. The silence in the dead room had a pressure to it, like depth. You would put it in front of the inquiry, Suveth said slowly, inside the Directorate's own theater, under On's gavel, where every procedural lever belongs to the man at Index. You are either the most foolish person on this capital, or you have seen something in that chamber the rest of us have not. I have seen the record, Selleck said. Your inquiry archives everything, Admiral, because the hegemony believes in its own posterity. The Directorate thinks the archive is its monument. I think the archive is a debris field that has not stopped accreting. Every seal number, every manifest, every formula spoken at my table goes into the hall of proceedings beyond recall or revision, and evidence entered there belongs to no one. Not to name, not to you, not even to the throne. He folded his hands. I am a small person, Admiral, from a small people. The only force I have ever had standing behind me is the file. I have found it sufficient. The Admiral looked at him for a long, pressurized moment, and then she did something Selak had never seen Hadron Plate do. It settled. The whole gray architecture of her shoulders came down half a measure, like a fortress unbarring one gate. Bansor wrote to me his last month, she said. He was my signal ensign once before the border. He wrote that he had spent 8 months guarding a human who said less in a week than a Directorate man says in a corridor, and that he had come to the conclusion, and he asked me to forgive him for it, that the prisoner was the only other professional on the station. Her dead eye lobe turned toward the wire-framed gantry, the threaded blue line of the shot. When the exchange was agreed, he requested the escort himself. He wanted to walk the man across personally. He said, a road safely ended is the only decoration that has never been devalued. She stood. The audience was over. Fleets ration their grief like the prisoner rationed words. Keep your envelopes, Arbiter. Keep them exactly as lawful as you have kept them. When the day comes that the chamber can be made to look at what it does not want to see, the banner will be standing where it can be useful. At the door of the sphere she paused, plate creaking. There is an old instructor of mine on the wrong side of the line. I am told you have seen the medical file. The inquiry has weeks left in it, and he may not. The banner asks nothing dishonorable, only this. When you sort your priorities, remember that some cargo spoils. Before the proof of life visit, before the isotope batch, there was one more key holder to walk, and Selleck walked it himself, because the third key on Endesa belonged to his own people, and a man should audit his own house before he audits an empire's. The Ethidri Registrar Trust kept its capital office in the deep commercial ring, behind a door with no sign, in chambers cut to cave dimness, and its custodian was Arbiter Emerita Vesuhal, who had examined Selleck for his license 38 years earlier and had not, as far as anyone could establish, been wrong about anything since the previous dynasty. She received him with thin tea and no questions for the first hour, which was manners, and then she set her cup down and asked him what he wanted with the Endesa key. "To see it," Selleck said, "with my own eyes, and the access ledger beside it. You believe our key opened that gantry?" It was not an accusation. She was pricing the claim. 60 years in the vault, and you believe it walked to a dead moon and let a rifle in. I believe nothing yet, Emerita. That is the entire profession you taught me. The old arbiter looked at him for a long moment with eyes like wet stones in lamplight, and then she rose and took him down herself 3 levels, past bonded vaults whose contents had outlived the governments that sealed them, to a drawer that required her touch and his witness and a third officer's count, and the Endesa Treaty key lay in its cradle under glass dulled by 60 years of nobody, its bonding seal intact, its ledger blank since the year of the poor. Selleck certified the inspection in his own hand and felt one part of the weight come off his hearts and a heavier part settle on, because an intact third key meant the field had only 2 bearings left in it, and one of them was a government that brought no weapons, and the other was a government whose own admiral had said, in a bronze room, the banner did not open that gantry. "Sit," Vesuhal said, when they were back in the dim. "Now you will tell me what you have stepped in, Selleck Mur, because you certify like a man with his sleeve caught in a winch," he told her. "Not the envelopes, not the channel, the shape only, the way one briefs an underwriter on a loss still smoking." And the old arbiter listened without moving, and when he finished she was silent for the length of a full pot of tea, which from her was consternation approaching panic. "There is a thing the trust holds that you do not know about," she said at last, "because it is shameful, and our people file shame under closed seals. 6 years ago, the Hegemony's Materiel Bureau conducted what it called a treaty, key security review. Standardization, they said. They asked every keyholder on the border to submit master profiles of their treaty locks for a joint integrity register citing a forgery scare they had themselves announced. The accord declined politely. We declined politely. And then we discovered, 8 months later, during an unrelated insurance survey of the Endesa ruin, that the gantry's lock plates had been serviced. Not open, serviced. New tolerances, factory-fresh wear surfaces on a moon where nothing had docked in a decade. We filed a protest through the Joint Commission. She turned her cup precisely. The protest was heard by the Commission's security referee, who ruled the service marks were weathering artifacts and closed the file. The referee's office was the Bureau of Materiel Verities. We recorded our dissent under seal with imagery, and we let it lie, because a small neutral trust does not accuse an empire's auditors of cutting themselves a key. We are not brave, Arbiter, we are old. Those are different survivals. The dissent, Selleck said. His voice came out strange to his own hearing. Under whose authority can the seal be lifted? Any arbiter of the neutral instance, said Vesuhal, defending a certification in open proceeding, may requisition trust records material to his seal. She regarded him, and something at the rims of her stone eyes did what Ithidri eyes do instead of smiling. You will want the imagery certified to litigation standard. It will take my clerks 2 days. We will charge the hegemony the standard fee because the trust shows no favor, and we will charge it accurately because the trust shows no fear either. That is the whole of our flag, Selleck. It has been enough for 600 years. See that you keep it flying over whatever it is you are about to do. He walked out of the dim with the requisition forms in his case and the capital's amber evening overhead, and he stood for a moment in the commercial ring's noise, freight calls, and tea sellers, and the 1,000 honest transactions of a city that mostly never learned what its government did in its name, and he thought, there it is, the whole field walked. A key cut in secret 6 years ago. A munitions lot certified dead the same year. A captain posted to the border for asking about clean numbers. An exchange agreed, a gantry serviced, a morning of salt. Name had not improvised anything ever in his life. He had built the lock, stocked the warehouse, chosen the exhibit, and waited for the border to need a wound. And the only flaw in all that patient architecture was that he had built it across ground, where 3 small, old, frightened, punctual peoples kept files. In the cell block under the chamber of the standing light, in the hours when the capital pretended to sleep, the human prisoner and his new warden played harbors. Selleck learned of it the way he learned everything in those weeks, sideways, in fragments, from the channel. Underwarden Cholavec had been Bansor's man, transferred to the capital with the prisoner, kept on by a directorate that wanted continuity in front of the cameras, and Vec had inherited, along with the prisoner, a problem the directorate's manual did not cover, which was what to do at night with a human who did not beg, did not bargain, did not weep, and did not sleep more than 5 hours. The answer turned out to be a game. Voss had drawn it from memory on the back of a ration carton, a grid of squares and channels, little tokens torn from carton board, freighters and tugs, and one pilot boat each. The rules as Vec eventually, shamefacedly, recited them to an Admiralty debriefer who recited them into a file that reached Etta Kale. You ran your freight through a shared harbor, and the wind changed every turn. And the player who lost was the player who tried to win every exchange instead of keeping the channel clear. Voss called it harbors. He said his grandmother had taught him on the kitchen table of a weather station, with sugar cubes. They played most nights. They did not speak much, by mutual constitution. But a directorate cell block is never private, and the recordings went where recordings go, and Selleck would learn long afterward that the night clerks of 3 separate ministries had begun, against every regulation, to follow the games like a serial, and that money had moved on them, and that when Voss once spotted Vec a 2-tug handicap because Vec had been on double shifts for the widow's escort detail, the duty room upstairs had gone quiet in a way that no proclamation about human savagery ever quite recovered from. It was around the 40th night, by the file's accounting, that Vec asked the only personal question either of them ever recorded. The morning on the Salt, Vec said, you were free, 40 paces in dust, and ours were all looking at the gantry. You went back. He was past saving, and you are not a physician, and you went back.
Why?
The tokens clicked on the carton board. The wind changed. He'd have come back for me, Voss said, and that, the file noted, was the whole of it. The human took the harbor mouth 2 turns later, and the underwarden lost his pilot boat to the tide. Rule, and upstairs in the duty room, a clerk of the Ministry of Tides paid a clerk of the Ministry of Roads an amount neither of them ever reported, and the hegemony's night shift went on learning carton game by carton game, what the directorate's daylight could not unteach them. Im called it the quietest invasion in history. Selleck corrected her. It was not an invasion. It was weather. It came in under the door. Director Pellernaim went to look at the weather himself, once, and the cell block recordings of that night were sealed by his own order, which was how Selleck knew, when a copy reached the channel anyway through 3 sets of Admiralty hands, that the directorate had begun to leak. Naim did not look like the most dangerous man on the Capitol. That was the first thing the recording taught. He was a neat, mid-sized hadron in a plain slate coat, no robes, no escort visible, his plate the unmemorable gray of wet paper, and he came into the cell at the hour between shifts, sat down on Vec's stool across the carton board as if he had been invited, and studied the grid of squares and channels for a long moment with his head tilted, an auditor finding an undocumented asset. The wind rule, he said at last. Explain it to me. Every turn the wind changes, Voss said. You don't get to pick, you get to trim. And the player who tries to win every exchange loses. Naim moved a torn token 1 square with a precise gray finger experimentally and set it back exactly where it had been. A child's game with a hidden sermon. They tell me half the night ministries are playing it. Do you know what I find interesting about you, Commander? In 8 months of recordings, you have never once said anything interesting. No threats, no bargains, no philosophy. My analysts have 400 hours of you, and the thickest part of the file is the silence. He looked up. Silence is expensive. I have priced a great deal of it in my career. Whose purse is paying for yours? Nobody's. It's cheap. You just say less. Everyone is paying for something. Naim folded his hands, and his voice stayed exactly level, which was the thing the night clerks who eventually heard the copy could not stop describing, that he sounded the same discussing a man's death as a man's luggage. Let me show you my board, Commander, since you have shown me yours. In a few weeks, the chamber will ask its question, and the answer is already filed. Your government will protest and trade with us anyway, because freight does not grieve. Your arbiter will go home to his burned office. The old trader across the line will die in his comfortable enemy bed, late, as the weak always are. And the border will hold, because borders hold on fear, and fear requires at intervals an exhibit. He tipped his head slightly, clinically. You are not a spy. I have known you were not a spy since before you were arrested. You are something far more useful. You are plausible. I am explaining this to you because you cannot repeat it, and because I find I am curious what a man does with the truth when it has no exchange value at all. There was a silence on the recording, 11 seconds. The carton board, the cell, the auditor, and the exhibit. He filed it, Voss said. Naim's vents moved once, a small dry ripple that the directorate's own kinesics manual classed as the laugh of a superior officer. He rose, smoothed his plain coat, and paused at the door. Captain Bansor asked me a question once, at a materiel review, in front of witnesses, he said. He asked why my bureau's numbers were always so clean. Soldiers notice supply, you see. It is the one audit they conduct with their lives. I had him posted to the border within the month, and the posting was a kindness, and I will tell you why it was a kindness, Commander. since we are being truthful in the dark. Because men who ask that question in the capital stop being men who are posted. Out there, at least, the question had room to walk. The pale gray eyes considered the human a final time. He liked you. It is in his reports that fatal warmth over and over. You will forgive me. I read everything. The door closed. On the recording, the human sat alone for a while with the carton board, and then methodically set up both sides for a new game, his and the empty stools, and made the empty stools opening move for it. The strongest one, the one Vec always missed, and the night clerks of 3 ministries, watching a sealed file they were not supposed to possess, understood the message even though the directorate's kinesics manual had no entry for it. He would play the dead man's side too. Nobody on that board was going to be left unrepresented. Selleck watched the copy once, in the dark, and did not sleep afterward. It was not the menace that kept him awake. It was the bookkeeping. Bansor had been moved to the border like a crate, years in advance, for asking one true question in the wrong room, and had ended on the salt of Endesa with his collar opened by stock that did not exist. The murder had not been planned in the spring. The murder had been inventory, waiting in a warehouse. Against the day the question needed answering permanently. An auditor, Wren had said. He simply audits. Selleck had spent 40 years believing files were how civilization remembered. He was being instructed, week by week, in how a state used them to forget. And the instruction was making him into something his guild had no formula for, which was a man with a temper, kept folded, like a slip in a day file, for the proper exhibit hour. The channel, meanwhile, had begun to move real tonnage, and with tonnage came the first lie, and the first lie nearly ended everything. It arrived as a position paper, hand-delivered to Selleck's lodgings by the Lord Protocol's third secretary, the slow-walking one, who delivered it with a blandness so perfect it was itself a message. The hegemony, the paper said, had reconsidered. A humanitarian resolution might yet be possible, the inquiry notwithstanding. As an earnest of good faith, the accord would first transfer architect Wren to a neutral medical facility. The hegemony would then review the human sentence with clemency among the available outcomes, and the schedule annex specified the review would occur within 90 days of the transfer. Selleck read it 3 times, and his heart settled into the cold rhythm they kept for fraudulent manifests. It was a beautiful instrument. It was also a confiscation dressed as a kindness. Wren surrendered first against a promise of review, the review's outcome unspecified, the 90 days expiring by no coincidence at all, after the inquiry's scheduled verdict. Take the cargo now, pay in weather. The protocol of the channel required him to transmit it verbatim, and he did. But the channel's protocol was also his own, written in his own hand. He would tell each side the truth about what the other side said. So when he met Etta Cale in the tramcar and laid the paper between them, he said, I am required to deliver this. I am permitted to observe that I have spent 40 years reading instruments of carriage, and this one has a hole in the hull below the waterline, and the hole is the word review. We saw it from orbit, Etta said. She slid the paper back. The answer is no, and the form of the no matters. So this is the Accord's exact reply. The Accord declines sequential performance. Simultaneity is not a bargaining preference. It is the entire agreement. We walk at the same hour we always walked. An arbiter, our drafters, added a sentence addressed to whoever wrote that annex, and I'm instructed to pass it through your mouth precisely. Something glinted in her face, hard and bright. Tell them, the Accord has noticed that it is being asked to pay for the same bridge twice, and it does not blame the river. Selleck carried the sentence back and watched the Lord Protocol's office unwrap it, and watched the word river land somewhere in the building above him like a depth charge, because the river, in the hegemony's oldest proverb, was the thing that flooded regardless of who held the crossing, and everyone in that corridor knew which directorate called itself the continuance. 2 days later, the position paper was withdrawn without comment. 2 days after that, Examiner Owen rose in the standing light and announced that the inquiry, in view of the gravity of the charge, would be extended, and the Chamber's calendar clerk read the new schedule into the record, and Selleck, certifying the day's exhibits with a steady pen, heard the date of the final session and did the arithmetic against a medical file he was not supposed to possess. The directorate had stopped trying to win the negotiation. It had decided to let the calendar do the killing. The verdict would come in 11 weeks. Ossel Wren's physicians had not promised him 8. That night Selleck sat in the dark of his lodgings long past the hour of thinking, the gray staff across his knees, and made the decision he had been circling since the salt. He could not shorten the inquiry. He could not move the throne, or arm the admiral, or soften the directorate. Every great lever on the Capitol was bolted to a floor he did not own. But a claims arbiter does not move levers. A claims arbiter walks the field, tags the debris, and builds the file until the file is heavier than the parties. And there was one piece of the field he had not yet walked, The most dangerous piece, the piece that was also a man. He sent for the channel's physician terms and he wrote, in his own cramped hand, a single amendment and routed it through both governments in the gray staff's name, neutral instance, administrative, beneath notice. The proof of life visit to architect Ossel Wren at the border station would be conducted by a hegemony physician, one officer of the outer banner, and the assessor of record, whose impartial observation would place the prisoner's condition beyond future dispute by either party. Both bureaucracies stamped it, neither read it. It was, after all, only the arbiter, only furniture, only a small dry person with a staff and a file, asking to go and look at some cargo with his own eyes. The border station was called Pellin Gate, and it hung on the demarcation like a bead on a wire, half its corridors lit in hegemony amber, half in accord white, with a customs hall between them where the two lights mixed into something neither government had a name for. The human side had brought Wren up from their inner systems on a hospital ship, and they had not done what Selak, schooled by a lifetime of hegemony pageantry, had half expected, which was to stage him. There was no flag behind the old architect, no banner of tender captivity for the cameras, because there were no cameras. There was a plain, warm room with a view of the wire, a Ithri-made heart cradle humming under his chair because human medicine had thought to order one, and a side table on which someone had set out salt bread and thin tea, which were the convalescent foods of the Hadran coastal provinces, and which meant that someone on a human hospital ship had taken the trouble to find out what a dying old man's childhood had tasted like. The hegemony physician examined him for 2 hours and emerged with a face like a cracked slate. The banner officer, a commander with convoy scars, stood witness at parade rest the entire time, and Selleck noticed that the commander's vents did a small involuntary flutter when Wren, out of old habit from a classroom 40 years closed, corrected the physician's grammar. Then it was the assessor's hour, impartial observation, beyond future dispute, and the room was cleared, and Selleck Murr sat down across the salt bread from the most dangerous mind the hegemony had produced in a century. Ossel Wren was small for a Hadran, and age had curled him smaller, his plate gone the color of rained on ash, his 4 eye lobes clouded at the rims. His hands had a tremor the heart cradle could not reach, but the eyes themselves behind the clouding were the eyes of the salt pan, the ones that had stood frozen over a dying captain, taking everything in, and Selak understood within 3 sentences that whatever the medical file said about the body, the instrument inside it had not lost a single calibration. The arbiter of the midpoint, Wren said. I watched you crawl the field that morning while the soldiers performed their emergency. Spiral pattern, outward, anchorage guild standard, I thought. There is the only person on this moon doing his actual job. He poured tea, with both shaking hands, refusing the cradle's help arm. I have been questioned by human intelligence for 12 years, Arbiter. Courteously, persistently, and latterly out of what I can only call habit, the way one visits an old relative. You are the first visitor in all that time whose questions I cannot predict. Ask them. Are you well treated? That is the question of record. Answer of record, yes, scandalously. Write it down. The old architect's vents wheezed something that was probably laughter. And now the question's not of record. You have perhaps 40 minutes before the physician invents a reason to return. Spend them properly. Selak set down his cup. The claim is the claim, he thought. Walk it. Architect, why does the Directorate of Continuance prefer you dead in human custody to alive at home? I have a theory built from freight patterns. I would rather have the cargo's own manifest. The clouded eyes turned to the window, the wire, the mixed light. Because I built the locks, Wren said simply. 30 years ago, when the Continuance was young and the hegemon was strong, I designed the authentication architecture of the state, the succession ciphers, the fleet's command verification, the instruments by which the hegemony knows an order is true. They have been improved since by my students, layer upon layer, but the foundations are mine, and a man who lays foundations knows where the soil is soft. He turned back. Director name was my student too, Arbiter. The most brilliant of them, and the one I declined to recommend for the architecture board, and I will tell you the sentence I wrote, because it has been pulling this border apart for 30 years. I wrote, he is the finest builder of locks I have taught, and he must never be given the keys because he believes the locks exist to protect the state from the truth, and not the truth from the state. The room was very quiet. Out on the wire, a freight string went by in the mixed light, white hulls, amber running lamps, the border doing its ordinary work under the extraordinary one. He has spent a career proving my sentence right in secret and burying everyone who— Read it, Wren went on, toneless as a recitation. The captain on the salt, I think, read it, or read something like it. And I am the last soft place in his soil. Alive at home, I am an old man whom the estates would honor, and whose word about the foundations, about what names Bureau can and cannot forge, would be believed over any seal. Dead in human hands, I am a martyr to human cruelty and a sealed file. He does not hate me, Arbiter. I doubt Peller has ever hated anything. He simply audits, and I am an exposure. And the human? Selleck asked. Voss. Where does he sit in the audit? Nowhere. That is the obscenity of it. For the first time, something moved under the old voice, slow and tectonic. I stood on that salt 60 paces from a man I had never met, who owed me nothing, whose government and mine have spent 9 years teaching our children to fear each other's silhouettes. And when the shot came, every trained being on that moon did the trained thing, dropped, scattered, screamed into their collars. He went back. 12 years, Arbiter. I have been studying humans the way I once studied lock metal, looking for the tolerances, the failure plane, the alloy lie. And on one morning of white salt, the study ended, because I saw the load test. He lifted his tea with both trembling hands and drank deliberately, a toast with the only instrument available. They are not unbreakable, you understand. Nothing is unbreakable. I built locks, I know. They simply choose, at the worst possible moments, by some defect of manufacture I have never located, to be load-bearing. One grows fond of a material like that. Selleck thought of the bootlesses, of Medic twice toward the line. Of he'd have come back for me, clicking across a carton board at night under the standing light. Architect, he said slowly, I am going to describe a piece of physical evidence to you, without telling you where it is or how it was obtained, and I am going to ask you one question about your own foundations, and the question is the real reason I amended the protocol to put myself in this room. You spoke of what names Bureau can and cannot forge. I have a munition casing fragment, lot stamped alloy dated. If the Bureau wished to manufacture a twin of such a fragment, attributed to human stock, what would it get wrong? The clouded eyes came fully open, all 4 lobes, and for one long moment Selleck saw the instructor architect of the 9th Banner entire, the mind that had built a state's locks looking, with vast professional appetite at one last problem. Nothing visible, Wren said. Alloy, stamped eyes, tooling marks, the Bureau is excellent. It would pass any inspection of surfaces. But munition alloys carry isotope signatures from their foundry batch, Arbiter, and foundry batches are cataloged for prize court arbitration under the commerce treaties, the one archive on this border that both governments maintain jointly, because both governments sue in it. The Bureau cannot edit an archive its enemy also holds. If they forge a human casing, they must cast it from stock on hand, and stock on hand is hegemony foundry, and the isotope ledger will say so to anyone with standing to request the comparison. The old architect set down his cup, and his tremor just for a moment seemed to still. A prize court isotope comparison can be requested by any licensed arbiter of the neutral instance with a claim in process. You would know better than I, of course. You are the arbiter. Yes, Selleck said, I am the arbiter. Then I will tell you the last thing, and you will take the salt bread with you for the journey, because I am told that is what one does. Wren leaned forward, ash-colored, dying, entirely alive. Whatever you are building, build it slowly enough to be ready and quickly enough to matter. I have one professional discourtesy left in me, Arbiter, and I intend to be punctual. Selleck filed the isotope request 9 days later, and he did it in the open, in the dullest possible clothing, which was the genius of it, because Im had found the claim. She had gone through the office's live files like a customs dog and emerged with a salvage arbitration so genuine, so boring, and so perfectly aimed that Selleck read her summary twice and then sat for a moment in honest admiration. An Ithidri towing consortium against a hegemony marine insurer over a hull lost to munition fire during a pirate clearance 4 years ago. Value disputed, liability turning on whose ordnance had actually holed the wreck, the Navy's or the pirates'. A claim, in other words, that could not be adjudicated without an isotope comparison of recovered casing fragments against the Joint Foundry Archive, and an arbiter of record, adjudications, with unquestioned standing to request one, and a guild rule, older than the hegemony's current dynasty, that comparison requests were batched, anonymized, and processed by the Archive Trust without disclosure of which fragments belonged to which claim. Envelope 41 went into the batch between 2 fragments of honest pirate ordnance, carrying a docket number that traced to a towing dispute, and the request crossed the border with 400 others in the Trust's quarterly sack, beneath the notice of anything with a flag. Then the only thing left was the waiting, and the inquiry filled the waiting the way rising water fills a hold. Examiner Oln had entered his final movement. The chamber heard the Directorate's ballistics conclave, slate-robed specialists who testified that the assassin's weapon had been of human naval pattern, and there, lifted into the great light, sealed and manifested, was a casing fragment recovered, the manifest said, from the north reaches of the Pan in a Directorate sweep conducted after the neutral parties had departed. Selleck certified it. The seal was true, the manifest was true, the wand went blue. The chamber sees what was tendered. He looked at the fragment turning in the projection, 40 meters tall, its lot stamp crisp, its surfaces excellent, and he thought of an old voice by the wire saying nothing visible, and he wrote the exhibit's docket number on his slip in a hand that did not shake, because somewhere under the Capitol, in a trust vault, its twin brother from the actual gantry was lying in an anonymous batch, waiting to testify about foundries. 2 days later, the directorate burned his office. They were tidy about it. A power fault in the Kars Anchorage third ring, regrettable, contained no casualties, the fire team swift and solicitous. Mur Adjudications lost its front rooms, its reception archive, and 40 years of bound precedent that existed in certified copy at the Guildhall, and so was meant purely as a message, the way everything the directorate did was a message. The annex vault, cut into Anchorage rock 2 levels down under a hull claim that did not exist, was not touched because it was not found. The second message came the same week, through the Licensing Bureau. A review of Arbiter Mur's neutral instance credentials had been opened, citing irregularities unspecified, outcome pending and pending. The Bureau regretted the Arbiter's commercial filings would be processed at reduced priority. Reduced priority, in Bureau dialect, meant never. They could not touch the assessor of record. The throne's own crystal protected the inquiry's neutral eye, so they had reached instead for everything else he was: the office, the license, the livelihood, the name. Im met him at the burned doorway with soot on her hands and the inventory already half done, and her voice when she spoke had lost every trace of the office. "You will not stop," she said. It was not a question, and it was not a request, and he understood, looking at her, that she had walked the same field he had and tagged the same debris. "Uncle, the night the proclamation came, you told me refusing was not permitted to occur. I have done the arithmetic since, neither is this. If they can burn a neutral man's office for certifying with one wrong word, then there are no neutral men. There is only freight that has not yet been seized. Finish the file. They may come past the office next," Selak said quietly. "Past property. You should be on the outbound side of the wire, child." "I have booked passage," Im said, and held up the docket case she had carried out of the fire. "For the quarterly archive sack, someone has to keep custody of the batch results, and the trust couriers are bonded, and I hold a courier bond because you made me sit the examination 11 years ago in case, you said, the office ever needed to move something no one else could be allowed to drop." She shouldered the case, small and straight in the sootlight, his sister's daughter. "You taught me the rule, Uncle. The arbiter belongs to the claim. Well, so does the arbiter's office." Selleck stood in the ruin of 40 careful years and found, examining himself with a claimsman's honesty, that the predominant thing in his hearts was not fear, and was not grief, and was a thing he had no real right to at his age, which was momentum. That night the channel carried one line each way, and the lines crossed somewhere over the border like 2 signal lamps. From Etta Kale, our orbital caught the fire on Karsay. The Accord reminds the arbiter that its hospital ships carry passengers of all flags, and asks nothing. From Selleck Mur, in reply, the first sentence he had ever sent through his own channel on his own behalf. The arbiter thanks the Accord, remains at his table, and notes that the quarterly archive sack is running exactly on schedule. The directorate moved the verdict. It was announced as efficiency. The inquiry's evidentiary phase, examiner Oln informed the chamber, had proven more conclusive than anticipated. In deference to the estate's crowded calendar, summation and the question of the chamber would be heard not in 11 weeks, but in 3. The tiers received it with the rustle of 200 beings consulting their own survival instincts, because everyone in the hegemony could read a clock being wound, even if no one could say aloud who was winding it. Selak read it differently, with a cold contraction of both hearts. 3 weeks was not efficiency. 3 weeks was a man somewhere in a slate tower looking at the same quarterly archive schedule Selak looked at, not knowing what was in the sack, knowing only that something on this border had started running on a timetable he had not written, and deciding to bring the executioner inside it. Peller name audited, and an auditor who cannot find the exposure forecloses the period. The capital, meanwhile, had begun to behave strangely in the way of a city that knows more than its newsbands. The harbor games were now an open secret. A satire troupe in the freight quarter fined for performing a sketch in which 2 clerks played a board game while their supervisors burned the building down around them, and the fine was paid, anonymously, within the hour, 40 times over. The widow of Captain Bansword declined, with thanks, the directorate's offer of a memorial oration in the standing light, and requested instead, in a statement of 1 sentence that the censors could find no grounds to suppress, that her husband be remembered by the words of his last service report, which the directorate then had to choose between publishing and visibly burying and buried, and the burial itself went through the ministries like a cold draft. And on the 40th night after the fire on Kars, the duty clerks of the Ministry of Tides, whose archives had quietly fed the Admiralty's reconstruction, held what their roster called a weather observance, which their grandfathers would have recognized as the old coastal vigil for sailors carried off by a storm whose name could not be spoken in the house. The hegemony was not rising. The hegemony did not rise. It was not that kind of state, but it was turning its face ministry by ministry, clerk by clerk, the way a field turns toward a change in the light, and the directorate could feel it and could not arrest it, because there was no one to arrest. There was no conspiracy. There was only weather, coming in under every door at once. Im came back over the wire with the quarterly results on the 19th day before the verdict. She came into the lodging, still in her courier bond grays, sat down across from her uncle, and laid the trust's sealed result packet on the table between them with both hands formally, the way their people presented the bones of the dead or the findings of the living. 412 comparisons in the batch, she said. 411 routine. And then there is ours. She broke the seal. Fragment, submitted under towing docket, anonymized. Isotope signature matched foundry of origin. Hegemony naval foundry at Cora Bray. Casting series confirmed. And uncle, the trust's archivists flagged the match themselves. Because the casting series is from a munitions lot the hegemony's own filings declare decommissioned and destroyed under audit certificate 6 years ago. She looked up. The certifying authority on the destruction was the Directorate of Continuance, Bureau of Materiel Verities. The shot that killed Bansor was fired from stock that does not exist, out of a warehouse that only one organization in the galaxy could have opened, and the paper saying the stock was destroyed is signed by that organization's own auditors. Selleck sat very still for a long moment, holding the page. And the exhibit, he said. The Directorate's fragment, the one in the standing light. The human pattern casing from the sweep. That is the other thing. Im's voice went flat and precise, her examination voice. You asked the trust for a second comparison under the same docket, surfaces against the Joint Tooling Registry. The exhibit fragment's die marks match a human naval pattern. Exactly, perfectly. Too perfectly. The dies that cut that pattern were retired by the Accord 4 years ago after a tooling recall, and the recall schedule is in the Joint Registry because the recall settled 9 insurance claims. The exhibit in the chamber was struck from dies that had already been melted when the casing was supposedly fired. She permitted herself, at last, one thin smile of her mother's. Names Bureau forged a human casing from a catalog, uncle, and the catalog was out of date. Nothing visible, the old architect had said, by the window at Pellin Gate. They cannot edit and archive their enemy also holds. Selleck rose and went to the annex case and took out the certification slips he had been folding into the day files for 5 months. The cramped ledger hand the cameras could read if they troubled to, tendered for gathered, docket numbers, bearings. Then he sat down and, with Im checking each line against the trust results, began to assemble the only weapon his whole long gray life had trained him to build. A file, chain of custody, envelope 41, salt to vault to trust to result. The firing bearing, tagged at the scene by the holder of the gray staff. The treaty key registry for the gantry locks, the foundry match, the destruction certificate with the Directorate's own signature block, the tooling recall. 40 years of habits, every page numbered, every seal logged, cross-indexed, duplicate certified at the Guild Hall, and a third copy sealed into the Trust's own vault under arbitration privilege, where no warrant the Directorate could obtain had ever once reached. It took them 6 nights. When it was done, the file was 81 pages, and Selleck Murr, who had spent 5 months being furniture, sent one line through the channel to Etta Kale. The claim is ready for hearing. Tell your principals to be ready to walk. Her reply came back in 4 hours, and it was the accord entire in 3 sentences, and Selleck read it twice and thought that whatever the catalog of that species' defects, no one would ever fault their drafting. Understood. The hospital ship Meridian Clear departs for the border in 9 days with architect rent aboard, medical suite live. In trust against an exchange we have not yet been offered. We find it is easier to be on time if one has already left. The question that remained was the only question that had ever mattered, which was how to make the chamber look. The file was lawful, certified, unkillable. It was also, Selleck knew with perfect clarity, inert. Evidence does not enter a hegemony proceeding because it is true. It enters because a person with standing lays it before the estates, and every door into the standing light was held by the Directorate. The examiner controlled the exhibit list. The Lord Protocol controlled the speaker's role. The assessor of record could certify what was tendered and could otherwise do nothing but sit at his table with 81 pages in his case, while man was condemned 11 paces away. Name did not need to find the exposure now. He only needed 3 weeks of doors. It was Im who saw it because Im had spent 11 years reading procedure the way gunners read ranging tables. The verification challenge, she said, on the fourth night before the verdict. Guild law. The instrument every insurer on this border has hated for 600 years. When an arbiter of the neutral instance certifies a thing, any party to the instance can challenge the certification, and the arbiter must then prove his seal in open session, evidence in support, and the forum cannot refuse to hear the proof, because the proof defends the forum's own integrity. It is the one speech no court can gag, uncle. The defense of the seal. She turned the page of the inquiry's founding crystal toward him, her finger on the throne's own watermark. You are certified into this proceeding as assessor of record by the hegemon's instrument. Your seal is the proceeding's neutral eye. If your certification is challenged in the standing light, you have the right, the obligation, the crystal says the duty, to lay before the chamber every document necessary to establish what your seal has and has not attested. Her eyes were bright and terrible. All they need to do is accuse you. And they will, Selleck said slowly, watching it assemble, watching 5 months of one wrong word come due. Because I have spent the whole inquiry writing tendered into a formula that says gathered in the permanent record of the Hall of Proceedings, where the estates' jurists read. The moment anyone with slate robes notices and moves against the foreign arbiter, the moment they decide to spend me as they spent the captain, the challenge convenes, and the seal must be defended, and the defense of the seal is the file. He looked at his niece with something close to awe. Child, we do not have to reach the chamber. We have to be attacked by it. Then we had better be irresistible, said Im. The bait went out the next morning, and it was the gray staff itself. Selleck filed openly, through the Lord Protocol's office, a routine end-of-proceeding declaration required of every neutral assessor, a schedule of his certifications, listed by exhibit, by date, and by formula spoken. 206 entries reading the chamber sees what was gathered. 11 entries, 11 exhibits, beginning with the flight recorder transcript and ending with the casing fragment, reading the chamber sees what was tendered. No commentary, no accusation, just a column of formulas filed in quadruplicate in the dullest possible clothing, by a small, dry person putting his affairs in order, and at the bottom, in the space the form provided for remarks, one sentence in cramped ledger hand. The variances are deliberate, and the assessor stands ready to defend his seal. Im hand-carried the original to the Hall of Proceedings, and the copies went, by guild rule too old to suspend, to every party of record, which included the examiner's office, the Admiralty's judge advocate, and the registry clerk of the estates, and Selleck Murr went home to his rented rooms, made tea, and sat down in the dark to wait for the state to read its mail. It took 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd, the summons came on slate-gray crystal, no watermark, the directorate's own instrument, and it did not summon him to a hearing. It summoned him to a private conference, examiner's chambers, before session. Name was not going to attack the seal in the open chamber. Name was going to offer him a door first, the way the state had offered Voss a door, because that was the procedure, and the procedure was the faith. Selleck went. The conference room behind the standing light was windowless slate, and Davish Oln stood in it alone, magnificent robes, regretful voice, and on the table between them lay the declaration with its column of formulas, and beside it, square and slate and silent, sat a second crystal that Selleck understood at one glance to contain his licensing review, resolved, in whichever direction the next 10 minutes determined. Arbiter, the examiner said, there appear to be errors of formula in your schedule. 11 instances of an archaic variant. The proceedings record should be tidy. Amend the declaration, attribute the variance to fatigue, and the Bureau, I am told, will conclude its review of your credentials favorably this week. The alternative, and the great warm voice laid each word down like masonry, is that the Directorate will be obliged to challenge your certifications in open session, with all that follows for a foreign national who has corrupted the record of a capital proceeding. You are a man of files, Arbiter Murr. Choose the clean file. And Selleck Murr, 61 years old, 400 ruined precedent volumes, 1 burned office, 8 envelopes of a dead captain's salt still under his fingernails by way of memory, looked up at the largest civilization on the border and chose. Challenge me, he said. The challenge convened on the first morning of the verdict week, and the standing light had never, in the century of its stones, held so many bodies. Word had moved through the capital the way the harbor games had moved, sideways, irresistibly, under the doors. The tiers of the estates were full an hour before the gavel. The military rings were full. The gallery behind the glass, where ministries sent their observers, held the tides and the roads and the treasury shoulder plate to shoulder plate, and in the uppermost shadow, unannounced, sat a row of storm gray that the ushers had somehow failed to log. The outer banner's judge advocate and 6 flag officers, attending their filing said, in the matter of the integrity of the record. The accused was brought to his rail because the proceeding was still his proceeding. Voss took his place in the burning light, thinner than ever, steady as ever, and as the warden stepped back, he looked across at the small ephedry being escorted to a witness rail that had not been used in 40 years, and what passed between them was nothing the recorders could archive, only one professional measuring another's load and finding the rating adequate. The Lord Protocol read the instrument. The Directorate of Continuance, as a party of record, challenged the certifications of the Assessor of Record, 11 variances, and prayed the Chamber strike the variant exhibits or compel their recertification. The Assessor would now defend his seal, as the founding crystal required, and the Chamber, the old formula ran, shall hear the defense entire, for the seal is the Chamber's own eye. Selleck stood at the ancient rail with his case on the ledge before him, and looked up at 2,000 eyes, and discovered that his hearts were beating in perfect ceremonial calm. The Assessor's seal, he began, attests one thing only, that what is shown to this chamber is what was collected from the world. For 206 exhibits of this inquiry I so attested. For 11, I could not, and spoke instead the variant formula, that the chamber saw what was tendered. The Directorate asks why. The defense of my seal is the answer, and the answer is in 81 pages, which I will now read into the record of the Hall of Proceedings, where they will remain beyond the reach of every person in this room, including myself. And he read. He read the raw distress log against the improved transcript, static burst by static burst, and showed the chamber the dogleg that had been composed into a dying ship's mouth. He read the collection manifest of the casing fragment, sworn as recovered from the North Pan in a Directorate sweep, and then he read his own scene tags, time-stamped, guild-certified, from the morning itself, demonstrating that the sweep's coordinates lay inside the spiral he had walked and tagged barren while the captain's blood was still warm. He read the tooling registry and the recall schedule and let the chamber arrive, page by page with no oratory at all, at the dies that had been melted before they fired. He read the foundry archive result, the isotope match, core bray, the casting series, and then, in a silence that had gone from institutional to geological, he read the destruction certificate, lot by lot, date by date, and the signature block of the Bureau of Material Verities, Directorate of Continuance, and the name above the seal. He did not say the name. He was an arbiter. He read the document, and the document said it. Examiner Owen rose then, because the procedure allowed examination of the defense, and the procedure was the faith, and what followed was the finest hour of advocacy Selleck ever expected to survive. Owen did not bluster. He took the file apart the way a master rigger takes apart a crane, joint by joint, looking for the one pin that would drop the load. The scene tags first. A foreign civilian collecting material evidence of a capital crime without warrant, without hegemony observers. Was that the neutral instance, or was it interference dressed in gilt gray? Selleck answered with the treaty text itself, the marshal of the line provisions, the arbiter's duty to survey a disputed lost site, and the 70-year-old precedent of the Alex Reach collision, in which the hegemony's own prize court had accepted, over its own Navy's objection, the scene tags of a Idri arbiter, because the court had written, the staff serves the line, not the banks of it. He read the sentence twice, the second time slowly, and watched it land in the jurist's ring like a thrown grapnel, the anonymized docket next. Concealment, Owen suggested, his great voice gone soft and reasonable. Evidence laundered through a towing dispute, a fragment smuggled into a commercial batch. Was this the candor of a neutral man? Selleck agreed mildly that it was concealment and invited the examiner to consider what he had been concealing it from. And then, while the chamber was still deciding whether the small alien had just said what it thought it had said, he requisitioned, as an arbiter defending his seal in open proceeding, the sealed dissent of the Registrar Trust, 6 years old, litigation certified, with imagery, and read into the record the serviced lock plates of a gantry no key had lawfully opened, and the name of the referee's office that had ruled fresh tooling to be weather after examining. The dissent noted with antique ithidry venom, neither the site nor the imagery, the file being closed prior to the survey appointment. The assessor concealed his evidence, examiner, Selleck said, from the organization that had already serviced a treaty lock in secret, burned a neutral office, and certified to this chamber a casing struck from melted dies. The Guild teaches us to insure cargo against the perils it will actually meet. I am prepared to apologize to the chamber for my accuracy. It was the only sentence of the whole defense that approached wit, and he regretted it for years afterward, a little, in the way a careful man regrets his one visible stroke of temper. The tears did not laugh, Hadron Chambers do not laugh, but the rustle that went through 200 robes had teeth in it, and the teeth were not for him. Owen stood quite still for a moment, and then went to the last pin in the crane, exactly as Im had predicted he must 11 days earlier in the dark over cold tea. He moved that the chamber's question be deferred and the entire matter transferred to a closed proceeding of state security where the file's gravity could be weighed away from foreign eyes. And Selleck heard, under the magnificent regret of the voice, the sound of a door being reached for, the last door, the one marked quietly. The registry clerk of the estates rose from her desk below the tiers. She was elderly, slate-robed, unremarkable, a fixture of the chamber whom Selleck had never once heard speak, and she read, in the dry sing-song of a woman reciting what she had recited at her investiture, the foundation statute of the Hall of Proceedings, that what has been read into the record of the standing light has been read to the hegemony entire and to its posterity, and may be sealed against the future never, by any office, including the thrones, for the chamber's memory is the chamber's honor, and a state that blinds its own memory has abolished itself. She sat down. She had not looked at the examiner once. The motion to transfer was not put to a vote. Motions, the Lord Protocol observed into the silence, require a mover willing to be recorded, and the directorate's bench had gone very quiet. Slate faces composed, vents barely moving, 20 officials performing the arithmetic of survivors and arriving, one by one, at subtraction. Then he laid the last page down and delivered to the largest civilization on the border, the only verdict a neutral man would ever be permitted, 4 sentences in the flat dialect of claims. A munition that was certified destroyed was fired on neutral ground from a position only treaty keys could reach. A counterfeit of foreign manufacture was then tendered to this chamber as collected truth. My seal does not reach the question of who. My seal states, and stands ready to die stating, that this chamber has been made to see things that were never in the world. The standing light did not erupt. It did something worse for the men it was looking at. It went quiet, ring upon ring, the particular quiet of 200 political survivors performing simultaneous arithmetic, and into that quiet, with the timing of a fleet action, Admiral Eckhart Suveth of the Outer Banner rose in the high shadow and requested, as a party of record in the matter of a murdered banner officer, that the chamber receive the Admiralty's own reconstruction in support of the assessor's seal, orbital tracks appended, weather service archives appended, and the request was a formality, and everyone knew it. The fortress had unbarred every gate at once. Examiner Oln stood motionless at his table, and Selleck, watching him, saw the precise moment the great instrument of his voice was set down, like a weapon surrendered at a customs desk. It was not shame. Selleck doubted the man had the organ. It was calculation completing. The file was in the hall. The banner was on the floor. The ministries were behind the glass. And the directorate's entire position had become, in the space of one morning's reading, an exposure. The throne did not let it run to a second day. The voice of the throne entered the standing light at the evening gavel, an office not a person, gray robes without insignia, and read from the watermark crystal a pronouncement of 9 lines that the capital's jurists would spend a generation annotating. The inquiry into the human vase was concluded without finding, its record sealed whole into the Hall of Proceedings. No exhibit struck. The chamber thanked. A separate proceeding in the matter of the murder of Captain Bansor and the integrity of the chamber's record was opened under the joint protection of the estates and the Admiralty, and the Directorate of Continuance was, pending its conclusion, relieved of its briefs touching the border. And the hegemon's government, the voice finished, in recognition of the failed humanitarian exchange of the spring, had authorized its completion, terms as previously negotiated, venue as previously agreed, under a marshal of the walk to be named by mutual consent of both powers. In the tramcar that night, the last ride of the Channel, Etta Kale poured the tea properly before herself, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, 2 tired professionals watching the freight ring turn. Without finding, she said at last, he doesn't get innocent, he gets unfound. 8 months in their cells, an assassination hung around his neck in front of the galaxy, and the cleanest paper this capital will ever issue him is a shrug. It is the largest concession an empire has made on this border in my lifetime, Selleck said, and it is also a shrug. Both things are true. That is rather the business we have been in, Madam Kale. He turned his cup. Your principals accept the martial clause? They proposed your name an hour after the pronouncement. The hegemony consented in 40 minutes. She looked at him over the tea. Fastest agreement in 9 years of cold border, arbiter. Both sides racing to trust the same small, stubborn person. You ought to put it on the office door once it's rebuilt. Im is having the door cast in bronze, Selleck said dryly. I have seen the invoice. Etta laughed, the first time in 5 months he had heard it, and then she set the cup down, and her face did the thing it did when she crossed from herself to her instruction. The Meridian Clear made the border 3 days ago, she said quietly. He's at Pellin Gate, arbiter. The physicians upgraded the intervention en route. His numbers are poor but holding, and when our medical officer suggested the walk could be done by chair, The architect informed her that he had walked onto our side of the line 12 years ago and possessed, I'm quoting the log, a professional obligation to balance the ledger on his own feet. She paused. Dawn after next. Andessa. The salt. Selak looked out at the turning ring, the gantry lights, the dark between them where a red glass line lay waiting on a dead moon, and found both his hearts had set their rhythm to it already. Then let us go and finish the claim, he said. The protocol of the second walk was drafted in 19 hours at Pelin Gate, in the customs hall where the two lights mixed, and Selak would remember the drafting, in later years, with more tenderness than the walk itself, because the walk was history and the drafting was craft. They sat at one long table, which was itself a clause. The first exchange had been negotiated by transmitted document between ships that declined to dock at the same station. Suveth brought the banner's judge advocate and a protocol colonel. The accord sent Etta Kale and a quiet treaty lawyer who said perhaps 40 words in 19 hours, every one of which stuck. Selak held the pen, the neutral pen, and the gray staff lay on the table's midline the whole session, on the seam between the amber light and the white, because the colonel had placed it there at the start, unbidden, and both delegations had glanced at it and said nothing. And that was the whole of the opening ceremony. They fought, professionally, over everything, and the fights were a pleasure to arbitrate, because both sides wanted the cargo to live, the sweep schedule, the medical parodies, drawn, so neither prisoner could be said to walk under the other's doctors. The pickup positions of the recorders, contested for 2 hours, until Etta Kale ended it by proposing that every instrument on the pan be jointly owned and its archive lodged with the Registrar Trust, a find of a negotiator who had learned, in 5 months of tramcars, exactly how this border had been saved. And Suveth's judge advocate looked at the clause and said, half to himself, in chamber dialect, witnessed by everything, ruled by no one, and wrote his initials before his admiral had finished nodding. At the 11th hour, the colonel raised escorts, and the table went carefully still, because everyone in the room knew what had walked one pace behind the prisoner. Last time it was Suveth who spoke. The banner would escort its own returning architect, she said, and as for the human the banner proposed, the request had been made through warden channels, and the Admiralty had reviewed it, that the escort of Commander Voss to the line be Under Warden Cholavec, unarmed at the Underwarden's own petition. The petition itself was appended. It was 4 lines in a cell block clerk's careful hand, and the 4th line said, "The commander was walked kindly once before, and the man who did it would expect it of me." Selak read the petition aloud, because the pen's duty was the record, and for a little while the customs hall was very quiet. 2 empires listening to a jailer asked to finish a dead man's shift. Entered as Clause 11, Selak said without objection, and there was none, and the treaty lawyer wrote the underwarden's name into the annex with, Selak noticed, the particular care some humans gave to small things they intended history to keep. In the last hour they came to the final clause, the one Selak had drafted alone the night before and laid on the table without comment, that at the midpoint of the walk, where the lanes crossed the place of the spring's death, all movement on the pan would pause for the space of 10 heartbeats, in memorial of Captain Bansor of the Outer Banner, who died at his post, conducting himself as a professional and a friend. The colonel read it twice and looked up. "Whose heartbeats?" he asked. Hadron hearts run slower than human ones, and there were 2 species at the table, and the question was real. And it was also, Selak understood, the protocol colonel of an imperial fleet asking, in the only language his commission permitted, that the pause be long. The slowest present, Selak said, and the clause was initialed in both scripts, and the session closed, 19 hours, no recesses. The gray staff never once moved from the seam, and Etta Kale stood, as she always stood, and said to the room in general, "Gentle beings, I have sat treaty tables for 30 years. This is the first one where nobody lied." And the judge advocate of the Outer Banner, who in 19 hours had conceded nothing he was not instructed to concede, answered her dry as salt, "Madam, note the absence of anyone whose trade it was." And that the Registrar Trust's archive records was the only moment in the drafting of the Andessa Protocol at which both delegations were heard, jointly and severally, to make the sound their respective species used for laughter. On the eve of the walk, 2 small things happened that no protocol had drafted, and Selak put both in his private file, the one he kept for evidence of the only claim he had never been able to close, which was the claim that the galaxy was worth the paperwork. The first happened in the cell block at the hour between shifts. Underwarden Vec brought the commander his service coat, pressed and mended, and the boots, the real ones, and the release inventory on its slate, every item to be signed against, 8 months of a man's pockets itemized by a state that documented everything it did, including its repentances. Voss signed down the column and stopped at the last line, and Selak, who read the inventory copy later, stopped at it too. Item bootlesses, pair, non-standard gift of capt, Banser deceased, retained by prisoner through proceedings disposition, prisoner's own. Voss sat for a while with the laces across his palm, the recording shows, and then he asked Vec whether the captain's widow would receive a message from him. And Vec said that no regulation forbade it, which from Vec was an oath of personal delivery. The message was the laces themselves returned with one line. He lent me these for a road he didn't get to finish. They've walked far enough to go home now. The reply reached Pelham Gate an hour before the cutters lifted for Andessa. It was the laces, sent back, rewrapped in the violet morning paper of the coastal provinces, with one line in a war widow's steady ceremonial hand. Sir, finish the road in them. That is the disposition he filed for you the day he requested the escort, and my house does not amend his paperwork. So when Merrick Voss walked the marked lane across the salt in the silver light of 2 dawns, he walked it laced by a dead man's last requisition, and of the 11 beings on the pan who knew it, not one was ever able to speak of it afterward in fewer than 3 breaths except the widow, who had said everything already in the only register the hegemony's oldest families kept for love, which was the language of forms correctly completed. The second thing happened on the marshal's platform, an hour before first dawn, while the sweeps were still walking the lanes under the work lights. Etta Cale climbed the 11 neutral paces with the 2 cups and a flask, in defiance of no clause anyone had thought to write, and they stood drinking human coffee on the seam of the line, the arbiter and the back channel, watching 2 empires check each other's salt for the second time in a year. I keep thinking about the first morning, she said. You on your knees out there with your envelopes, and all of us lifting away and leaving you alone on a dead moon with the truth in your luggage. 5 months, arbiter, you sat in their chamber with it. I have to ask. The night the office burned, what kept you at the table? Sella considered the question with the care it had earned. All the answers that were true. The claim is the claim. The file defends itself. Refusal was not permitted to occur. What he finally said was none of them, and all of them, and the only sentence in 5 months he had never once rehearsed. When the captain fell, he said, your commander went back. 60 paces from the line, Madam Cale. I have measured my whole life in fee schedules, and that morning I was given, free of charge, an exhibit of what a being does when no court is watching, and the price of decency is everything. I am an arbiter. I price things. He turned his cup slowly in his dry fingers, watching the work lights move on the salt. I concluded I could not afford to be less than the cargo. Etta Cale looked at the small gray person beside her for a moment, and then she did the thing her whole stubborn species did at the exact moments when speeches were owed and would have spoiled it. She refilled his cup properly before her own, and they stood on the line in the cold and drank, and said nothing further at all. 2 professionals at the midpoint, waiting for the light. Andessa had not changed. Dead moons keep their appointments. The first dawn came up thin and silver over the salt pan, and the red glass line ran 4 kilometers across the white, exactly as it had run for a century, except at the midpoint, where the treaty engineers of both powers had spent 2 days under each other's instruments building what the new protocol required. A marshal's platform 11 paces square straddling the line itself, neutral by construction, reachable from either side by a marked lane swept hourly and walked, before each sweep was certified, by officers of both fleets side by side, because the first rule of the new protocol, written in Selak's own ledger hand and initialed by an admiral and a director general of the Accord in the same hour, was that no one on Andessa would ever again stand anywhere alone. The North Gantry was gone. The hegemony had asked for that clause itself, and the Banner's engineers had brought the old customs ruined down with cutting charges a week before, in daylight, on every public band, and let the galaxy watch the dust settle, which was, Etta Cale observed, the most fluent sentence the hegemony had spoken in 9 years. Selak Mur stood on the marshal's platform with the gray staff in both hands and watched the 2 delegations form up in the silver light. On the hegemony side, the storm gray of the outer banner, and only the banner. The protocol named the escorting service, and the estates had voted the honor to the dead captain's fleet by acclaim. Admiral Suveth stood at the head of her line, scarred plate burning silver at the edges, and at her order the banner formed not a cordon but a corridor, 2 ranks facing inward. The formation a fleet makes for a road safely ended. On the Accord side, 9 humans in unarmored coats, hands visible. They had been offered, under the new protocol, the right to bear arms at the line. Etta Cale had returned the clause with one amendment, the single most quietly vicious thing Selak ever saw a diplomat do to an empire. The Accord declines as before. Let the record show which side is now armed to walk on Andessa and which side never has. At the appointed minute of the first dawn, the cutters set down, and the 2 prisoners came out onto the salt, and the pan held its breath the way a chamber holds it. Ossel Wren came from the human side, as he had come before in the same broad winter coat, over which the physicians had lost and conceded a final argument, and he refused the chair at the ramp exactly as the log had promised, and set out down the marked lane on his own feet, short steps, ash-colored plate in the silver light, balancing a 12-year ledger one pace at a time. A human medical officer walked the parallel lane on the far side of the rope, matching him step for step the whole way, close enough to reach him in 2 seconds, far enough to let the record show he walked alone. Merrick Voss came from the hegemony side in his own service coat, returned to him pressed and mended, and Selleck saw at once that he was carrying something, and that the wardens had let him. A flat parcel under one arm, carton board tied with cord. At the edge of the lane, under Warden Cholovek stood his post stiffly, vents clamped with regulation, and as the prisoner passed him, their eyes met, and Voss stopped and turned and put out his hand, human fashion. Vec looked at the hand. Then he took it, plated fingers careful around the small alien bones, 2 professionals concluding a long shift, and on the public bands of 2 civilizations, in front of the fleets of both, the hegemony shook hands with its spy. The 2 prisoners drew level with each other at the midpoint, 60 paces from the line, where a man had died in the spring, and where the new protocol, Clause 9, Selleck's hand, Suveth's initials, required all movement to pause for the space of 10 heartbeats, in memorial before the walk concluded. They stopped. The pan went silent except for the wind working the salt. Wren said something to Voss then, very quietly, in the coastal dialect of his childhood, that the directional pickups barely caught and the linguists would argue about for years. What the cleanest enhancement suggests, and what Selleck, 11 paces away, would always swear by his seal he heard, was the old instructor's formula for a student leaving the 9th Banner School with honors. The work was sound. Go and build. Voss looked at the old enemy architect a moment and nodded once the way he did, and answered with the only sentence anyone ever taught a weather courier for partings. Clear skies, architect. Mind the crosswind home. Then the 10 heartbeats were up, and the gray staff came down, and they crossed. It was nothing at the end, the thing both empires had bled and burned and very nearly gone to war over a second time. 2 tired beings walking past each other on white salt, one toward a corridor of storm gray plate that came to present arms as a body, the other toward a thin line of brown coats where nobody saluted at all because the humans were too busy grinning, and the second dawn came up while they walked, the double light laying every shadow out twice, and Selleck Merce stood on the platform between the empires and held the staff steady and found, to his enormous professional embarrassment, that his eyes had quietly let him down. Wren reached the banner corridor and stopped before his student. Whatever passed between the admiral and her instructor went unrecorded. The banner had switched off its own pickups. Fleets rationed their grief. The galaxy saw only this: the most decorated officer on the border bowing her scarred plate to a small ash-colored old man in a human winter coat, and the old man, with a tremor in both hands and no hesitation anywhere else in him, reaching up to straighten her collar tab, which had not needed straightening, the way an instructor dismisses a class. Voss reached his own line and was absorbed into it. Coats closing around him, a hand on his shoulder, another, no ceremony at all, and Selleck, watching, understood that this too was a dialect, and that the humans were fluent in exactly one register of triumph, which was relief. At the foot of the human ramp, Voss stopped and turned back toward the line, and held up the carton parcel so the pan could see it, and then handed it to the Accord's protocol officer with instructions the channel would deliver to Selleck, in writing, a week later. The parcel was the harbor board, the original ration carton and torn tokens, and the instruction was that it be conveyed with the compliments of the maker to the duty room of the Ministry of Tides, whose night clerks, the note said, owe the underwarden 3 games and me nothing at all. It hangs there now, behind glass, with the tide rule written out in 2 scripts, and the ministry's roster still calls the last watch of the month the weather observance, and no one in the hegemony's government has ever once asked them to take it down. The pronouncements when they came were anti-climax, which Selleck considered the highest compliment history pays to careful work. The joint proceeding ran 14 months. Peller's name was never tried in the standing light. The hegemony does not exhibit its own organs. He was audited. The Bureau of Material Verities was unwound certificate by certificate. 6 more decommissioned lots were found to be breathing, and the director of continuance was retired, by the throne's mercy, to a sealed coastal estate with his correspondence privileges suspended, which for a man whose entire instrument had been the file, was, observed, the only sentence on the books that qualified as poetic. The name of Bansor was entered in the banner's honor roll under the words he had chosen himself, in his last service report, for someone else. He conducted himself, at all times, as a professional and a friend. The licensing review of Arbiter Selleck Mer was concluded favorably, with apologies, in writing on watermark crystal, which M had framed and hung in the rebuilt office directly above the spot where the fire had started, a decision Selleck pretended for years not to understand. And on Karst Anchorage, on an evening in the cold season, a final parcel arrived by bonded courier, human postage, no crest. Inside was a claims file, genuine, intricate, gloriously dull, a salvage dispute over a refrigerated hauler on the Velas run, the very dispute that had walked into his tea cellar wearing a brown coat half a year before, now settled, closed, and certified, with the losing shipper's payment instrument attached. On the cover sheet, in a firm human hand, was written, "Your fee, arbiter, plus the file for your archive. You said the shipper would lose. The accord finds your rulings hold up." It was signed E. Kale, and under the signature, smaller, "The T is better on your side of the wire. Expect me when the next impossible thing needs a midpoint." M logged it, because the office logs everything. Claim concluded, all parties satisfied, no appeal. She left the registry's final field, cause of loss, to her uncle, as she always did, and Selleck sat at his desk in the dark for a while. In the old cave quiet, thinking of salt and staffs and corridors walked slowly, of a captain who escorted kindly, of an architect punctual to his own homecoming, of a human who went back, and of the one law underneath all the laws he had served for 40 years, the law no empire had yet managed to repeal, that the truth, like freight, like weather, like an old man walking, arrives. He took up the scribe pen, and in the cramped ledger hand the cameras could read if they troubled to, he filled the last field of the file and closed the registry for the night. Cause of loss, none. The cargo came home.